In the late 19th century, when America's industrial confidence was still stitched together by iron foundries, wooden mills, and the promise that machines could tame both land and labor, the story of the Daisy BB gun did not begin with weapons at all. It began with wind. In 1882, in the small town of Plymouth, Michigan, the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company opened its doors as a manufacturer of farm windmills, those skeletal towers of steel and wood that dotted the Midwest and turned invisible currents into mechanical certainty. Windmills were symbols of control and survival, especially in a rural nation still recovering from the Civil War and pushing westward, and the Plymouth factory was built accordingly. Utilitarian brick, tall windows to draw in daylight, and a layout that emphasized repetitive precision rather than artistry. The architecture reflected the mindset of the era: industry as order, progress as something that could be assembled bolt by bolt. Clarence Hamilton, the company's founder, was not a gun maker, nor did he initially intend to be. His firm's early products were practical and unromantic, designed to pump water and grind grain. But the 19th century American factory floor was also a place of improvisation, where spare parts often became prototypes for entirely different ideas. According to company records and contemporaneous trade publications, one of Hamilton's workers fashioned a small air-powered gun using leftover materials, a novelty more than a product. When a potential customer tested the device and reportedly exclaimed, "That's a Daisy," the name stuck, not as a brand strategy, but as a spontaneous remark that captured the casual enthusiasm of the moment. By 1886, the Plymouth Iron Windmill Company quietly shifted part of its production toward these small air rifles, and within a few years, windmills were no longer the firm's primary identity. This transition from agricultural machinery to consumer weaponry was not sudden, but it was decisive. The late 19th century was a period in which American childhood itself was being redefined. Urbanization and compulsory schooling were changing how young people spent their days, and a growing middle class had both the disposable income and the cultural appetite for toys that promised adventure rather than utility. Daisy's early BB guns were marketed as tools for marksmanship and discipline, framed as safe alternatives to firearms in an era when real rifles were commonplace in rural homes. The language used in early catalogs emphasized character building and responsibility, tying the act of shooting not to violence but to self-control and manliness. This rhetorical framing would become one of the company's most powerful tools, shaping public perception for generations. As Daisy's BB guns gained popularity, the factory itself became a quiet monument to a new kind of American industry. The Plymouth plant expanded, adding space for assembly lines that produced tens of thousands of air rifles a year. Brick walls enclosed machines that stamped metal parts with rhythmic regularity, and the soundscape of the building, compressed air, clattering steel, shouted instructions, mirrored the transformation of the product itself. What had once been an improvised novelty was now standardized, serialized, and shipped nationwide. Architecture and manufacturing philosophy converged here. Repetition created reliability, and reliability created trust. Parents who might never have allowed a child to handle a powder-burning firearm were persuaded by the solidity of the Daisy name, reinforced by the physical presence of a factory that looked permanent and respectable. By the early 20th century, Daisy Manufacturing Company, as it would soon be renamed, had embedded itself deeply into American culture. The company relocated to Plymouth, Michigan permanently and later expanded operations to other locations, following labor markets and transportation routes. Advertising grew increasingly sophisticated, appearing in magazines and mail-order catalogs that reached millions of households. Daisy's products were no longer just tools, they were rites of passage. The BB gun became a symbol of boyhood independence, a controlled flirtation with danger that was socially sanctioned and commercially packaged. This symbolism was not accidental. Daisy's marketing borrowed heavily from frontier mythology, echoing the romanticized narratives of the American West that were flourishing in popular fiction and early cinema. The darker undercurrent of this story begins here, in the tension between image and reality. While Daisy promoted its BB guns as safe and educational, injury reports began to surface as early as the 1910s. Medical journals documented eye injuries caused by air rifles, and pediatricians warned that the guns were not toys in any meaningful sense. Daisy responded not by retreating from the market, but by refining its messaging. Safety pamphlets were introduced, emphasizing adult supervision and proper use while the core fantasy remained intact. The company's ability to navigate this contradiction, selling a weapon to children while insisting on its harmlessness, would become a defining feature of its legacy. The interwar period intensified this dynamic. In 1939, Daisy secured the license to produce the Red Ryder BB gun based on the popular comic strip by Fred Harmon. This partnership fused industrial manufacturing with mass media storytelling, embedding Daisy's product within a fictional universe of cowboys and moral clarity. The Red Ryder gun was not just an object, it was a narrative device, allowing children to imagine themselves as heroes of a sanitized frontier. The timing was significant. On the eve of World War II, America was once again preparing its youth culturally, if not militarily, for a world defined by conflict. The Red Ryder BB gun became one of the most successful products in the company's history, and its lever-action design mimicked real firearms closely enough to blur the line between play and preparation. The factories that produced these guns evolved alongside the products. When Daisy eventually moved its headquarters and primary manufacturing operations to Rogers, Arkansas in the late 1950s, the new facilities reflected mid-century industrial optimism. Low-slung buildings replaced vertical brick structures, emphasizing efficiency and scale. Wide assembly floors and fluorescent lighting replaced tall windows and natural light, signaling a shift from artisanal industry to modern mass production. The architecture was cleaner, more anonymous, and more powerful in its ability to produce volume. In Rogers, Daisy could manufacture millions of BB guns a year, feeding a national and eventually global market. Yet beneath this efficiency lay unresolved questions about responsibility and consequence. By the mid-20th century, Daisy BB guns were involved in thousands of documented injuries annually in the United States. Court cases began to test the limits of product liability, and public debates emerged about whether air rifles should be regulated more strictly. Daisy navigated these challenges with careful legal strategy and continued emphasis on education rather than restriction. The company funded safety campaigns, partnered with youth shooting programs, and positioned itself as a steward of responsible gun culture rather than a profiteer. This dual identity, guardian and seller, educator and manufacturer, created a moral ambiguity that has followed Daisy into the present day. The story of the Daisy BB gun empire is therefore not simply about a factory or a product. It is about how industrial America learned to package risk, how childhood became a marketplace, and how architecture, advertising, and mythology worked together to normalize the presence of weapons in everyday life. The brick walls of Plymouth and the sprawling plants of Rogers stand as physical reminders of these choices, built environments that made certain cultural outcomes possible while obscuring their costs. To understand Daisy is to understand a quieter, more insidious side of American industrial history, one in which danger was minimized not by elimination, but by branding. By the time the United States entered World War II, Daisy manufacturing had already spent decades perfecting a delicate balance between innocence and imitation, selling objects that looked and functioned enough like firearms to thrill young users while remaining legally and culturally classified as toys. The war did not interrupt this trajectory so much as deepen it. Like many American manufacturers, Daisy adapted parts of its production capacity to support the war effort, producing components and training aids that aligned with federal contracts, while its consumer products quietly receded from public focus. This period reinforced a powerful association between manufacturing, patriotism, and national duty. Factories were no longer merely places of commerce. They were framed as engines of democracy itself. Daisy emerged from the war with its industrial legitimacy strengthened and its symbolic connection to American identity reinforced. In the post-war years, as soldiers returned home and suburbanization reshaped the nation's physical and psychological landscape, Daisy found itself perfectly positioned to capitalize on a new domestic ideal. The American suburb was designed around the promise of safety, privacy, and controlled freedom. Streets curved inward, lawns replaced fields, and childhood became increasingly structured around the home rather than the wider community. Within this environment, the BB gun assumed a new role. It was no longer just a rural pastime or a frontier fantasy. It became a suburban artifact, something a father could pass to a son as a gesture of trust and continuity. Daisy's advertisements from the late 1940s and 1950s reflect this shift clearly, depicting tidy neighborhoods, smiling parents, and boys learning responsibility under watchful supervision. Violence was absent from these images, replaced by the idea of mastery and restraint. Architecturally, Daisy's facilities mirrored this suburban ethos. The Rogers, Arkansas plant, which would become the company's central hub by the late 1950s, was built with expansion in mind. Its layout favored horizontal growth, echoing the sprawl of the communities its products increasingly served. The factory's design emphasized efficiency and predictability, qualities prized in an era defined by mass consumption. This was not a place for experimentation or visible risk. It was a controlled environment producing controlled danger. The BB gun, in this sense, was an ideal commodity for the post-war economy, offering excitement within boundaries that appeared firm and reassuring. Yet beneath this carefully curated image, concerns continued to accumulate. Medical literature throughout the 1950s and 1960s documented a steady stream of injuries associated with air rifles, particularly among children. Eye injuries remain the most common, often resulting in permanent vision loss. These reports were not hidden, but they rarely disrupted Daisy's momentum. Instead, the company adapted by emphasizing safety education more aggressively, publishing manuals and sponsoring marksmanship programs that framed the BB gun as a tool requiring respect rather than fear. This approach aligned with broader American attitudes toward firearms, which increasingly emphasized individual responsibility over regulation. Daisy's products thus became early participants in a cultural logic that would later dominate national gun debates. The cultural saturation of the Daisy BB gun reached a new peak in 1983 with the release of the film A Christmas Story, adapted from the writings of Gene Shepard. The movie's central object of desire, the red Ryder BB gun, was presented as both a symbol of childhood longing and a source of adult anxiety. The repeated warning, "You'll shoot your eye out," echoed decades of real-world concerns while simultaneously reinforcing the gun's iconic status. Daisy did not initially commission or control this narrative, but it benefited enormously from it. Sales of the Red Ryder surged in subsequent years, and the BB gun was permanently cemented in the American imagination as a nostalgic artifact rather than a controversial product. Popular culture had completed what advertising alone could not. It had transformed risk into memory, danger into sentiment. This nostalgic framing obscured ongoing changes within the company and the industry at large. By the late 20th century, Daisy faced increased competition from foreign manufacturers and new materials that altered both production and perception. Plastic components replaced metal in many models, reducing costs but also subtly shifting the product's emotional weight. A plastic gun did not carry the same implied seriousness as a steel one, even if its capacity to injure remained similar. Daisy navigated this transition carefully, retaining traditional designs like the Red Ryder while expanding into cheaper, more brightly colored models aimed at younger audiences. This diversification reflected a broader commodification of play, in which the boundaries between toy and weapon grew increasingly blurred. Regulatory scrutiny also intensified during this period. Several states and municipalities considered or enacted restrictions on air guns, particularly regarding their sale to minors. Daisy responded through lobbying and public relations, emphasizing the company's long history and its commitment to safety. The argument was not that BB guns were harmless, but that they were manageable within a framework of parental oversight and education. This stance resonated with policymakers reluctant to intervene in what many voters still considered a normal aspect of childhood. The result was a patchwork of regulations that left the core of Daisy's business model intact. The factory itself became a site of both continuity and concealment. While tour and museum displays highlighted Daisy's craftsmanship and heritage, the realities of industrial production, accidents, labor disputes, and environmental concerns remained largely invisible to the public. Like many mid-century manufacturers, Daisy benefited from a cultural tendency to separate consumption from production, allowing consumers to enjoy the symbolic meaning of the product without confronting the conditions under which it was made. This separation extended to the consequences of use as well. Injuries were framed as individual failures rather than systemic outcomes, reinforcing the company's narrative of responsibility without accountability. As the 20th century drew to a close, Daisy stood as one of the last major American air gun manufacturers still producing domestically. This status was celebrated as evidence of resilience and tradition, even as global supply chains reshaped the broader industry. The company's survival was not accidental. It was the result of decades of careful positioning, cultural alignment, and narrative control. Daisy had learned how to exist in the space between danger and nostalgia, between weapon and toy, and it had built factories, both physical and symbolic, that made this balancing act appear natural. The darker story of America's BB gun empire is therefore not marked by a single scandal or revelation, but by accumulation. Layer upon layer of design choices, marketing decisions, and architectural investments work together to normalize an object that carries real risk while rarely being treated with corresponding seriousness. Daisy's factories did not simply produce BB guns. They produced a cultural logic in which controlled harm was acceptable, even desirable, as a means of shaping character. Understanding this legacy requires looking not only at what Daisy made, but at how America learned to see it. As the United States moved into the final decades of the 20th century, the Daisy Manufacturing Company found itself operating in a nation whose relationship with guns had become increasingly fractured. Where earlier generations had largely accepted firearms and air guns as ordinary tools of rural life or rites of passage, the late 1960s and 1970s introduced a new atmosphere of unease. High-profile assassinations, rising urban crime rates, and the televised reality of violence reshaped public consciousness. In this environment, Daisy's BB guns occupied an ambiguous position. They were not central to national debates about gun control, yet they were unavoidably connected to them, sitting at the edge of a conversation that questioned how Americans introduced their children to instruments capable of harm. Daisy responded to this cultural shift not by changing its core products, but by deepening its emphasis on tradition and safety. Company literature from the period reveals a deliberate turn toward institutional partnerships, including shooting sports organizations and youth programs that framed marksmanship as a disciplined, almost meditative activity. This approach aligned with the broader American tendency to treat guns as moral tools whose impact depended entirely on the character of the user. By embedding its products within structured environments, ranges, competitions, supervised training, Daisy reinforced the idea that BB guns were educational devices rather than consumer novelties. The narrative suggested continuity with a past in which firearms knowledge was considered an essential life skill rather than a political issue. The architecture of Daisy's Rogers facilities subtly reinforced this message. By the 1970s, the plant had grown into a sprawling industrial complex, with designated areas for assembly, testing, and packaging that reflected an almost ritualized production process. Quality control stations tested air pressure and accuracy, ensuring consistency across millions of units. This emphasis on precision was not only practical but symbolic. It allowed Daisy to present itself as a responsible manufacturer, one that treated its products with seriousness even when the broader culture increasingly questioned their place. The factory became a controlled environment that stood in contrast to the perceived chaos of the outside world, a physical manifestation of order amid cultural uncertainty. Yet the gap between intention and outcome continued to widen. Studies published throughout the 1980s documented that BB guns remained one of the leading causes of non-powder firearm injuries among children in the United States. Emergency room physicians noted that many parents underestimated the power of modern air rifles, assuming they were unchanged from the weaker models of earlier decades. Daisy's engineering improvements, stronger springs, better seals, higher velocities, had made its products more accurate and durable, but also more capable of causing serious injury. These advances were rarely foregrounded in marketing materials, which continued to rely on imagery rooted in nostalgia and innocence. The legal system increasingly became the arena in which these contradictions played out. Lawsuits against Daisy and other air gun manufacturers typically revolved around failure to warn claims, with plaintiffs arguing that the risks were not adequately communicated. Courts often ruled in favor of the manufacturers, citing existing warnings and the expectation of parental supervision. These decisions reinforced a legal framework that placed responsibility primarily on individuals rather than corporations. For Daisy, this outcome validated its long-standing strategy: provide warnings, promote education, and allow cultural norms to do the rest. The company's survival depended not on denying risk, but on diffusing accountability. At the same time, Daisy's brand was undergoing a subtle transformation. The rise of video games and electronic entertainment began to erode the centrality of physical play in childhood. BB guns, once symbols of modernity and excitement, risked becoming relics, Daisy countered this threat by leaning even more heavily into its historical identity. Company-sponsored museums, anniversary editions, and heritage-focused marketing campaigns presented the BB gun as a link to a simpler, more authentic past. This strategy did more than sell products. It offered reassurance to adults unsettled by rapid technological change. Purchasing a Daisy BB gun became an act of cultural preservation, a way to pass down values perceived to be disappearing. This emphasis on heritage reached its most visible expression in the careful curation of Daisy's public image. The company highlighted its American roots, its long-standing presence in Rogers, and its role as a major local employer. The factory tour emphasized craftsmanship and continuity, often glossing over automation and the global supply chains that now fed into production. The architecture of the plant, though modernized, was framed as part of a living tradition. Its long corridors and humming machines presented as descendants of the brick factories of Plymouth. This narrative blurred the line between history and branding, making it difficult to distinguish genuine legacy from strategic storytelling. Meanwhile, the broader gun industry was fragmenting along ideological lines. Firearms manufacturers increasingly aligned themselves with political movements, while air gun makers like Daisy remained comparatively apolitical, at least publicly. This neutrality was itself a strategy. By avoiding overt political engagement, Daisy preserved its position as a family-oriented brand, one that could exist comfortably in households across ideological divides. The BB gun was not framed as a symbol of resistance or identity, but as a shared cultural artifact. This positioning insulated the company from some of the backlash faced by firearm manufacturers, even as it benefited indirectly from a national culture deeply familiar with gun imagery. The darker implications of this neutrality lie in what it obscured. By presenting itself as above the political fray, Daisy avoided engaging with deeper questions about how early exposure to weapon-like objects shapes attitudes toward violence and power. Scholars in sociology and childhood development began to explore these issues more seriously in the late 20th century, examining how play with simulated weapons could normalize aggressive behavior or desensitize users to harm. While findings were mixed and often contested, they introduced a layer of complexity that Daisy's official narratives rarely addressed. The company continued to emphasize individual character and family values, leaving systemic considerations largely unexplored. As the century closed, Daisy stood as both a survivor and a symbol. It had weathered wars, cultural revolutions, and economic shifts by remaining flexible without appearing to change. Its factories produced millions of BB guns that traveled into garages, basements, and backyards across the nation, quietly reinforcing a particular vision of American childhood. The story of this era is not one of overt malice or deception, but of omission. By focusing on tradition and responsibility, Daisy allowed uncomfortable questions to fade into the background, replaced by the reassuring rhythm of production lines and the familiar click of a lever action gun. To understand the full weight of Daisy's legacy, it is necessary to recognize how deeply it is embedded in American systems of belief. The company did not invent the idea that controlled exposure to danger builds character, but it perfected the industrial means of delivering that idea at scale. Its factories were not merely sites of manufacture. They were instruments of cultural continuity, shaping how generations of Americans understood risk, play, and responsibility. The darkness of this story lies not in secrecy, but in normalization, in how something capable of harm became so thoroughly woven into the fabric of everyday life that its presence was rarely questioned. In the opening years of the 21st century, Daisy entered a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and profoundly altered. The company's products remained largely unchanged in form and function, but the cultural environment into which they were released had shifted. America's relationship with violence, particularly involving young people, had become increasingly anxious. School shootings dominated national headlines, and public discussions about guns were no longer abstract or regional. They were visceral, emotional, and deeply personal. Although BB guns were rarely implicated in these tragedies, their visual similarity to firearms placed them within the same psychological space. Daisy's long-standing strategy of quiet neutrality now required more careful calibration, as even peripheral association with gun culture carried reputational risk. Daisy's response was measured and deliberate. The company avoided dramatic public statements, instead reinforcing its emphasis on safety education and controlled environments. Product packaging became more explicit in its warnings, and instructional materials were updated to stress eye protection and supervised use. These changes were incremental rather than transformative, reflecting Daisy's belief that continuity itself was a form of stability. Internally, engineering teams continued to refine air rifle mechanisms, balancing consumer demand for power and accuracy against the growing expectation that products be demonstrably safer. This balancing act was not unique to Daisy, but the company's historical weight made every adjustment symbolically charged. To change too much risked undermining a century of brand identity. To change too little risked appearing indifferent to a changing world. The architecture of Daisy's Rogers facilities during this period offers a subtle but revealing lens into this tension. Renovations focused on efficiency, automation, and compliance with modern safety standards, yet the outward appearance of the complex remained intentionally modest. There were no grand corporate facades or overtly futuristic designs. Instead, the buildings projected permanence and restraint, qualities that aligned with Daisy's public image. Inside, however, production increasingly relied on computerized machinery and global supply inputs, a reality largely invisible to consumers. This disconnect between external image and internal operation mirrored the broader cultural gap between nostalgia and modernity that defined Daisy's brand. Public perception of BB guns also evolved in response to urbanization and changing patterns of childhood. Backyards grew smaller, public spaces more regulated, and unsupervised outdoor play less common. In many communities, firing a BB gun became impractical or explicitly prohibited by local ordinances. Daisy's products, once designed for open fields and rural settings, now existed within tighter spatial constraints. This shift quietly altered the meaning of ownership. The BB gun was no longer a ubiquitous childhood accessory, but a conditional one, dependent on geography, regulation, and parental comfort. Daisy adapted by expanding its range of lower-powered models and indoor target systems, reframing marksmanship as a controlled hobby rather than free-roaming play. At the same time, the company continued to benefit from its deep entanglement with American memory. Nostalgia proved to be one of Daisy's most resilient assets, particularly as adults sought tangible connections to their own childhoods. Limited edition reproductions of classic models, especially the Red Ryder, sold not only as functional objects but as commemorative artifacts. These products were often purchased by adults rather than children, displayed rather than used. In this context, the BB gun became a symbol divorced from its original purpose, a physical reminder of a past imagined as safer and simpler. Daisy's factories thus produced not just weapons, but memory objects engineered to evoke emotion as much as utility. This shift toward nostalgia did not eliminate risk, but it redistributed it. When BB guns became collectibles or supervised hobbies, their potential for harm appeared diminished, even as their mechanical capabilities remained unchanged. Scholars studying risk perception have noted that familiarity often reduces perceived danger, a phenomenon evident in Daisy's enduring popularity. The company's long history created a sense of trust that newer manufacturers struggled to replicate. Consumers were more likely to assume that a product they remembered from childhood was inherently safer than unfamiliar alternatives, regardless of objective differences. Daisy's brand capital thus functioned as a form of cultural insulation, protecting it from scrutiny that might otherwise have intensified. Yet this insulation was not absolute. Advocacy groups concerned with child safety periodically revisited the issue of non-powder firearm injuries, calling for stricter regulation and clearer public messaging. These efforts rarely resulted in sweeping legislative change, but they contributed to an ongoing undercurrent of unease. Daisy's silence on these debates was strategic, allowing the company to avoid alienating customers while relying on existing legal frameworks to maintain its market position. The absence of controversy became part of the brand's identity, reinforcing the perception that BB guns were peripheral to the nation's deeper struggles with violence. The global context further complicated Daisy's story. As air guns gained popularity internationally, particularly in Europe and Asia, Daisy expanded its export markets and partnerships. Different countries imposed different standards, forcing the company to navigate a complex regulatory landscape. In some regions, air guns were treated with greater seriousness than in the United States, subject to licensing or power restrictions. These differences highlighted the cultural specificity of Daisy's American success. What functioned as a childhood rite of passage in one context could be considered a controlled weapon in another. Daisy's ability to adapt to these distinctions underscored its industrial sophistication, even as it raised questions about the universality of its core narrative. Within Rogers, the factory remained a significant local presence, providing jobs and reinforcing a sense of community identity. This relationship between company and town mirrored earlier patterns seen in American industrial history, where manufacturers became anchors of regional stability. Daisy's longevity fostered loyalty, both among employees and residents, further entrenching the company's image as a benign, even benevolent institution. A criticism of the product could thus feel like criticism of the community itself, discouraging sustained local opposition. Architecture again played a role here, with the factory's physical integration into the townscape symbolizing mutual dependence. As Daisy moved deeper into the 21st century, its story became less about expansion and more about endurance. The company had learned how to persist without provoking, how to remain present without dominating the conversation. Its BB guns continued to enter American homes quietly, accompanied by the same promises of responsibility and tradition that had defined them for generations. The darkness of this chapter lies not in escalation, but in stasis. By changing just enough to survive, Daisy preserved a cultural artifact whose implications were rarely re-examined, allowing historical assumptions about childhood, risk, and weapons to continue largely unchallenged. In this sense, Daisy's factories can be understood as engines of continuity, maintaining not only production lines but patterns of thought. Each BB gun assembled carried with it a legacy shaped by decades of architectural choices, marketing strategies, and cultural compromises. The company's success depended on making these layers feel invisible, allowing consumers to focus on the familiar weight of the object in their hands rather than the complex history embedded within it. To trace that history fully is to confront how deeply industrial practices and cultural narratives intertwine, shaping everyday experiences in ways that are easy to overlook and difficult to undo. To fully understand the legacy of Daisy's BB gun empire, it is necessary to step back from individual products and controversies and examine the deeper systems that allowed the company not only to survive, but to become a quiet constant in American life. Daisy's endurance was never simply about manufacturing skill or brand recognition. It was about alignment between industry and ideology, between architecture and behavior, between childhood fantasy and adult reassurance. Few American companies managed to embed themselves so thoroughly into the emotional infrastructure of everyday life, while remaining largely absent from serious moral reckoning. That absence, sustained over more than a century, is where the darkest contours of the story finally come into focus. Throughout its history, Daisy benefited from a uniquely American belief that exposure to controlled danger is a formative good. This belief, inherited from frontier life and reinforced by industrial capitalism, held that competence emerges through risk, and that responsibility is learned by handling potentially harmful tools. Daisy did not invent this idea, but it industrialized it. By standardizing and mass-producing BB guns, the company transformed a philosophical belief into a consumer practice. Millions of identical objects carried the same lesson into homes across the country. That danger, when branded correctly, could be domesticated. This was not an accidental outcome, but the result of deliberate design choices that balanced realism with restraint, power with plausibility. The factories that made this possible were themselves expressions of that philosophy. From the brick solidity of Plymouth to the horizontal sprawl of Rogers, Daisy's manufacturing spaces embodied control. They were environments where force, compressed air, metal springs, kinetic energy was measured, regulated, and released in predictable ways. This physical regulation mirrored the cultural message embedded in the product. Just as the factory contained energy within machines and procedures, the BB gun promised to contain danger within rules and supervision. Architecture thus became a silent partner in Daisy's narrative, reinforcing the idea that risk could be engineered into acceptability. Yet history shows that engineered containment is never perfect. Despite decades of warnings, education campaigns, and design refinements, BB gun injuries persisted with remarkable consistency. The data did not suggest catastrophic failure, but it did reveal a steady background level of harm that society appeared willing to tolerate. This tolerance is significant. It suggests that Daisy's success was not merely commercial but moral, in the sense that it aligned with what Americans were prepared to accept as normal. The BB gun occupied a space where injury was regrettable but not scandalous, where harm was individualized rather than systemic. Daisy thrived within this space precisely because it did not challenge these assumptions. Over time, this normalization shaped not only consumers but institutions. Schools, scouting organizations, and youth clubs incorporated air rifle programs that echoed Daisy's framing of discipline and responsibility. Insurance policies, municipal codes, and legal precedents adapted to accommodate BB guns as a special category, neither toy nor firearm, but something in between. This in-between status insulated the product from the scrutiny applied to more overtly dangerous technologies. Daisy's empire was built not on denial of risk, but on its careful categorization, ensuring that the BB gun never fully entered the realm of moral urgency. The company's internal culture reflected this same logic. Employee accounts and local histories describe a workplace defined by routine, pride, and continuity. Generations of families worked at the Rogers plant, producing the same objects year after year. This continuity fostered a sense of legitimacy that extended beyond economics. When a product is made by neighbors, friends, and relatives, criticism feels abstract, even disloyal. Daisy's physical presence in the town reinforced this dynamic, anchoring moral judgments to lived relationships. The factory was not just an employer, it was a civic institution, and its products carried the weight of that association. As digital culture reshaped childhood in the early 21st century, Daisy's relevance increasingly depended on its symbolic value rather than its practical necessity. Children spent more time indoors, immersed in virtual worlds where simulated violence was omnipresent and consequence-free. Against this backdrop, the BB gun could be framed as almost wholesome, a tangible physical activity that demanded patience and respect. This comparison worked in Daisy's favor, repositioning the BB gun as a corrective to digital excess rather than a relic of analog danger. The irony was profound. A mechanical weapon gained moral legitimacy by contrasting itself with virtual representations of violence, even as both engaged similar fantasies of control and mastery. This shift further insulated Daisy from critique. Conversations about youth violence increasingly focused on media, mental health, and access to high-powered firearms, leaving air guns at the margins. Daisy's products were rarely central to these debates, yet they continued to introduce children to the mechanics and symbolism of guns. The BB gun became a first language, teaching how to aim, how to squeeze a trigger, how to associate precision with satisfaction. Whether this constituted preparation, normalization, or simple recreation depended largely on perspective, but the company itself remained officially silent on such interpretations. Daisy's role was to provide the object, not to define its meaning. The darkness of Daisy's story, then, is cumulative rather than dramatic. It lies in the company's ability to persist without ever forcing a reckoning, to adapt just enough to remain acceptable while leaving foundational assumptions intact. Daisy did not cause America's complex relationship with guns, but it contributed to its texture, embedding weapon-like objects into childhood under the guise of tradition and responsibility. Its factories produced more than BB guns, they produced familiarity, and familiarity dulled scrutiny. Over generations, the extraordinary became ordinary and the ordinary became invisible. In examining Daisy's BB gun empire, what emerges is not a tale of villainy, but of comfort. Comfort is often more powerful than persuasion, and Daisy mastered its manufacture. The company offered reassurance to parents, nostalgia to adults, and a controlled sense of power to children. It wrapped risk in routine and history, allowing it to circulate freely without provoking alarm. This achievement, measured in longevity and cultural penetration, is also its most troubling legacy. When danger is made familiar, it ceases to feel dangerous, even when it remains so. The story of Daisy ultimately forces a broader question about American industrial history. How many other products, practices, and institutions operate within similar shadows, sustained by tradition and emotional attachment rather than continuous ethical examination? Daisy's BB gun empire endures not because it resolved these questions, but because it made them easy to ignore. Its factories still stand, its products still sell, and its name still evokes childhood more readily than harm. That dissonance between what is remembered and what is quietly repeated is the final architecture Daisy built, one not of brick or steel but of belief. In the end, the story of America's BB gun empire does not conclude with collapse, exposure, or reform. It concludes with continuity, and that continuity is precisely what makes it historically significant. Daisy's endurance into the present day reveals something fundamental about how American industry survives moral tension, not by resolving it, but by dispersing it across time, institutions, and everyday habits until it becomes indistinguishable from normal life. The BB gun never needed to be defended loudly, because it was rarely attacked directly. It lived in the quiet spaces between categories, shielded by familiarity and reinforced by repetition. By the early decades of the 21st century, Daisy had effectively completed its transformation from manufacturer to cultural fixture. The company no longer needed aggressive expansion or innovation to justify its existence. Its products sold because they had always sold, because grandparents remembered them, because parents associated them with discipline rather than danger, and because the object itself had become a shorthand for a certain version of American childhood. This form of legitimacy is difficult to challenge, precisely because it feels earned rather than constructed. Yet legitimacy built over time can be more resistant to scrutiny than legitimacy built through argument. What is striking, when viewed across more than a century, is how rarely Daisy's core assumptions were seriously questioned within mainstream discourse. The BB gun was repeatedly framed as an answer to broader anxieties rather than a contributor to them. When childhood was perceived as becoming too soft, the BB gun promised toughness. When children seemed too sheltered, it promised responsibility. When digital culture felt too abstract, it promised physical engagement. In each era, Daisy's product was positioned as corrective rather than problematic. This adaptive symbolism allowed the company to remain relevant without fundamentally re-examining the role it played in shaping attitudes toward weapons and control. The factory once again provides a revealing metaphor. Modern Daisy production relies on layers of automation, compliance protocols, and global logistics that obscure individual agency. No single worker is responsible for the finished object in the way early craftsmen once were. This diffusion of responsibility mirrors the cultural diffusion surrounding the BB gun itself. Harm, when it occurs, is attributed to misuse, negligence, or accident, rarely to design or tradition. Just as no single employee controls the entire production process, no single decision-maker is seen as accountable for the product's long-term social effects. The system functions smoothly precisely because responsibility is everywhere and nowhere at once. Daisy's historical silence on deeper ethical questions should not be mistaken for ignorance. Corporate archives and internal communications demonstrate an acute awareness of public perception and legal risk. The company understood, often better than its critics, where the boundaries of acceptability lay. It did not need to push those boundaries, it only needed to remain comfortably inside them. In doing so, Daisy became a case study in how restraint, when guided by market logic rather than ethical inquiry, can be as powerful as expansion. The absence of controversy became a strategic asset. The architectural symbolism of Daisy's facilities reinforces this reading. Unlike the monumental factories of early industrial titans or the glass-walled headquarters of modern technology firms, Daisy's buildings are modest, functional, and largely unremarkable. They do not invite attention. They blend into their surroundings just as the product blends into cultural memory. This architectural modesty is not accidental. It reflects a philosophy of endurance through invisibility, of influence exercised quietly rather than proclaimed. The factory does not dominate the skyline, but it continues to operate year after year, shaping the material culture of childhood without demanding acknowledgement. In historical terms, Daisy occupies a unique position. It is not simply a toy company, nor a weapons manufacturer in the conventional sense. It exists in a liminal category that allowed it to outlast competitors and critics alike. This position was maintained through careful language, selective storytelling, and an unwavering commitment to tradition as a moral shield. The BB gun was never presented as new or experimental. It was always already old, already familiar, already proven. That sense of temporal depth discouraged urgency, making reform feel unnecessary or even disruptive. The darker implications of this legacy become clearer when viewed alongside broader patterns in American industrial history. Again and again, industries that produce controlled harm, whether through chemicals, machinery, or consumer products, have relied on normalization rather than denial. Daisy's story fits this pattern with unsettling precision. The BB gun did not need to be reimagined as harmless. It only needed to be remembered as ordinary. Over time, ordinariness proved to be the most effective defense. This does not mean that Daisy's story is one of inevitability. At multiple points, different choices were possible. Stronger design constraints, clearer public messaging, or a willingness to engage openly with emerging research might have altered the company's trajectory. Instead, Daisy chose consistency, trusting that the cultural frameworks supporting its products would hold. For more than a century, they did. That success, measured in years rather than profits alone, reveals how deeply those frameworks are embedded in American life. As the Daisy BB gun continues to pass from one generation to the next, it carries with it more than compressed air and steel pellets. It carries assumptions about risk, responsibility, and tradition that were forged long before its current users were born. These assumptions persist not because they are universally examined or agreed upon, but because they are rarely questioned at all. The true legacy of America's BB gun empire lies in this quiet persistence, in the way an object can shape behavior and belief simply by remaining present. The Daisy factory still produces, the assembly lines still move, and the familiar designs still emerge from boxes and packaging. There is no final reckoning, no dramatic endpoint. Instead, there is continuation. And in historical terms, continuation is never neutral. It is the result of countless decisions not to change, reinforced by architecture, marketing, and memory. To look at Daisy's story in full is to see how industrial power can operate most effectively when it feels like tradition, and how the most enduring forms of influence often leave the least visible traces. If the earlier chapters of Daisy's history describe how an industrial object became culturally invisible, the final layer of the story lies in how that invisibility continues to reproduce itself across generations. Long after the original conditions that gave birth to the BB gun have faded, the frontier, the agrarian household, the necessity of early mechanical competence, the object remains, carrying meanings that no longer need explanation. This is how traditions survive modernity, not by remaining relevant to present conditions, but by becoming emotionally untouchable. Daisy's greatest achievement was not engineering or marketing, but temporal insulation. The BB gun was protected by time itself. In historical analysis, this phenomenon is often described as inherited normalcy. Practices passed down without renewed justification acquire a moral neutrality that newer practices must earn. Daisy's products benefited from this dynamic more than most. By the time serious public scrutiny of youth violence emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the BB gun was already framed as a pre-political object, something that existed before debate and therefore outside it. This framing was reinforced not only by advertising but by memory. Adults remembered their own childhood encounters with BB guns as personal milestones rather than social experiments. The object became autobiographical, and autobiographical objects are notoriously resistant to critique. This resistance was strengthened by the way Daisy's narrative intersected with American masculinity. For much of its history, the BB gun was marketed almost exclusively to boys, wrapped in language of independence, discipline, and self-mastery. These themes were not unique to Daisy, but Daisy refined them with unusual consistency. In doing so, the company helped encode a subtle lesson that controlled violence when practiced early and privately was a legitimate component of identity formation. This lesson was rarely articulated explicitly, which made it all the more powerful. It operated beneath awareness, reinforced by repetition rather than argument. The architectural environments in which Daisy's guns were produced and used further reinforced this lesson. The factories emphasized order, precision, and hierarchy, while shooting spaces, backyards, fields, informal ranges were framed as zones of autonomy. Together, these spaces created a loop. Disciplined production enabled controlled release, and controlled release justified disciplined production. The BB gun was both the product and the proof of this system. Its continued existence affirmed the idea that danger could be domesticated through structure, even when evidence suggested otherwise. From a broader historical perspective, Daisy's story parallels other American industries that thrived by occupying moral gray zones. Tobacco, leaded gasoline, and certain industrial chemicals followed similar trajectories in their early phases, normalized through familiarity before their risks were fully acknowledged. The crucial difference is scale. BB guns rarely caused mass harm, which allowed their risks to be dismissed as statistically insignificant. Yet history shows that scale is not the sole measure of impact. Cultural conditioning, especially when applied to children, operates through accumulation rather than catastrophe. Daisy's influence was diffuse, spread across millions of small, seemingly inconsequential interactions. This diffusion complicates accountability. There is no singular moment to point to, no definitive scandal that demands resolution. Instead, there is a pattern of acceptance sustained by institutions, families, and markets alike. Daisy did not impose its products on an unwilling public. It responded to and reinforced existing desires. This mutual reinforcement blurs the line between cause and reflection, making the company both a driver and a mirror of American attitudes toward risk and control. Such systems are difficult to dismantle because they feel participatory rather than imposed. In recent years, as discussions about childhood development, trauma, and socialization have grown more nuanced, some scholars have begun to revisit the role of weapon-like play in shaping long-term attitudes. These discussions remain contested and far from conclusive, but they mark a departure from the assumptions that once went unquestioned. Daisy, however, remains largely unchanged in its public posture. The company continues to emphasize safety, tradition, and responsibility, maintaining a narrative that has proven resilient across radically different eras. The absence of evolution in this narrative is itself telling. It suggests that Daisy's success depends not on adaptation to new ethical frameworks, but on the persistence of old ones. What ultimately distinguishes Daisy's BB gun empire is not the presence of darkness, but the absence of light shone directly upon it. The company's history unfolds in the margins of larger stories. Industrialization, suburbanization, consumer culture, gun politics, rarely becoming the main subject of inquiry. This marginality allowed Daisy to shape everyday experiences without attracting sustained examination. The BB gun became part of the background of American life, as familiar and unquestioned as the factory that produced it. In closing, the dark story of America's BB gun empire is not a story of hidden crimes or deliberate deception. It is a story of comfort, repetition, and inherited belief. It shows how industrial systems can embed themselves so deeply into cultural routines that their implications fade from view. Daisy's factories continue to operate, its products continue to circulate, and its name continues to evoke nostalgia rather than scrutiny. History in this case does not end with revelation but with persistence. That persistence is the final, unsettling truth. When an object capable of harm becomes ordinary, its power no longer lies in what it does, but in what it teaches without speaking. Daisy's BB gun taught generations of Americans how to hold danger, how to normalize it, and how to pass it on quietly, respectfully, and without ever needing to explain why.